Fighter jets need real men. My dad once mocked, smirking as he flicked my flight application off his mahogany desk. Those words had hollowed out my chest for years. But the ultimate humiliation arrived this morning, standing in the crowded tactical briefing room at Nellis Air Force Base, surrounded by hundreds of male pilots. I stood silently in the corner, wearing a sterile, patchless flight suit. Mason, my half-brother, strutted over and pointed his finger inches from my nose. He smirked, raising his voice for the room to hear. My sister came here to find a husband. Dad said she's better suited for paperwork than trying to fly. The entire room erupted into snickers and locker room laughter. I kept my jaw locked, my hands firmly clasped behind my back. Then the heavy oak doors swung open. The 3-star general stepped in. He grabbed the flight roster, his eyes scanning the crowd until they locked onto my face. The general froze, the color draining from his cheeks. He lowered the clipboard, whispering into the dead-silent room. Wait. You're Falcon 1. Before I tell you what happened, please take a moment to like and subscribe to the channel. But only if this story resonates with you. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. 2 weeks before the general exposed my identity, I sat in the most expensive steakhouse in Las Vegas, dying another quiet death. My dad, a retired colonel named Richard Baker, hosted a lavish dinner to celebrate Mason's selection for the red flag exercise. I sat at the edge of the table, my posture rigid, observing them like hostile targets on a radar screen. The host had seated 8 of us around a circular booth, upholstered in oxblood leather, but the arrangement told the whole story. Dad sat dead center. Mason sat at his right hand, already nursing a $30 bourbon. My stepmom, Evelyn, sat on Dad's left, her diamond bracelet catching the overhead light every time she reached for her wine glass. 2 of Dad's retired Air Force buddies and their wives filled in the gap. I sat at the far end, pressed against the wall, a massive floral centerpiece physically blocking my face from my father's line of sight. When we first arrived and the hostess placed the flowers in the center of the table, Evelyn had leaned over and whispered something to the waitress, pressing a folded bill into her palm. 2 minutes later, the centerpiece migrated to my end, right in front of my plate. Nobody else seemed to notice. I noticed. The smell of charred ribeye and truffle butter hung heavy in the air. Dad's retired buddies were already 3 drinks deep, trading war stories about Cold War intercepts and barracks pranks. The clinking of crystal glasses punctuated every punchline. Mason leaned back in the booth and draped his arm around the leather, spreading out like he owned the restaurant. He hadn't earned a single combat hour. His flight evaluations were average at best. But tonight, he was the star, and the entire table orbited around his manufactured brilliance. Dad tapped his crystal glass with a silver knife. The clinking silenced every conversation. He reached into his tailored jacket pocket and pulled out a heavy velvet box, the kind with a magnetic clasp that snaps with authority. He popped it open, tilting it toward the table so everyone could see. An $8,000 Breitling aviator watch sat nestled in black silk. The sapphire crystal face caught the candlelight and threw blue flickers across the white tablecloth. Evelyn clapped her hands together in exaggerated delight, her freshly manicured nails glinting, her eyes darting sideways toward me to verify I was watching. Dad's buddies nodded in approval, murmuring about fine German craftsmanship. Dad handed the box to Mason, puffing out his chest like he was pinning a silver star on a combat hero. For the future of the skies, he declared, his voice thick with a pride he had never once directed at me. Mason strapped it on his wrist, immediately twisting his arm left and right to admire the weight against his skin. He lifted his bourbon and looked directly at me over the rim. He gave me a slow, condescending wink. The applause died down. The table chatter resumed. Then Dad turned his gaze to me. The shift was instant, like someone had flipped a switch behind his eyes. There was no pride, no warmth, no recognition that his firstborn daughter was sitting at the same table. Just the cold calculation of an auditor reviewing a ledger and spotting a bad investment he couldn't write off. He reached into the inside pocket of his sport coat and carelessly slid a thin paper envelope across the white linen tablecloth. It traveled the length of the table like a note being passed in a classroom. I stopped it with 2 fingers before it slid off the edge. I picked it up. The paper was thin, almost tissue weight. I opened the flap. Inside was a $50 grocery store gift card. The plastic was cold and smooth against my fingertips, stamped with a generic image of fruit and bread. It wasn't even new. The corner was slightly bent like it had been sitting in a kitchen junk drawer. Evelyn reached across the table past the centerpiece she had specifically moved to block me and patted my hand with a sickeningly sweet, pitying smile. The kind of smile you give a child who didn't win the spelling bee. I pulled my hand back sharply, tucking it under the table into a fist. Dad's buddy Gary laughed a short burst through his nose and muttered something to his wife about how, at least, it's practical. I am an active duty officer with thousands of classified flight hours across 4 aircraft platforms. I have survived 9 Gs of force that would render a civilian unconscious in 4 seconds. I have landed crippled aircraft in 0 visibility sandstorms. But sitting there staring at a plastic grocery card meant for discounted bread and canned soup, while my half-brother wore a watch worth more than my first car, the betrayal of my own blood pressed against my ribs like a hydraulic vice. Nobody at that table flinched. Nobody dropped their eyes in shame. Evelyn resumed her conversation about a spa weekend. Mason ordered another bourbon. This was normal to them. I was the line item they tolerated, not the child they loved. I pushed my chair back, the legs scraping harshly against the hardwood floor with a sound that cut through the table chatter. I placed my napkin beside my untouched steak. I excused myself in a voice that was perfectly level and walked to the restroom with measured, precise steps. I counted 17 steps from the table to the women's room door. The moment the heavy wooden door clicked shut behind me, the restaurant noise vanished. The silence swallowed me whole. I stood in front of the marble sink, gripping the edges with both hands until my knuckles turned stark white. The veins stood out along my forearms. I looked at the woman in the mirror. Bloodshot eyes. A jaw clenched so tight the tendons in my neck stood out like cables. My dad's voice rattled inside my skull like a marble in a tin can. Fighter jets need real men. I closed my eyes, forcing my breathing into a tactical rhythm. In through the nose for 4 seconds. Hold for 4. Out through the mouth for 4. The fluorescent light above the mirror buzzed and flickered, once casting a brief shadow across my face. I gripped the sink harder. The cold marble bit into my palms. I opened my eyes. The hurt daughter was gone. The woman staring back at me had the cold, calculating eyes of an intelligence officer mapping a target package. No tears, no trembling lip. Just a flat, steady gaze that could read a threat at 800 yards. I reached down and smoothed the unwrinkled fabric of my dress slacks with both hands, a slow, deliberate motion. I straightened my posture, rolling my shoulders back until I felt my spine align. I didn't shed a single tear. Crying is a biological response to pain. I was done feeling pain for people who had never once felt pain for me. I pushed away from the sink, opened the restroom door, and walked past their table without breaking stride. I grabbed my coat from the back of the chair in one fluid motion. Dad didn't look up. He was cutting into a $40 steak. Mason was taking a selfie with his new watch, angling his wrist against the candlelight. Evelyn was reapplying lipstick using the reflection in her butter knife. Nobody said goodbye. Nobody asked where I was going. I pushed through the heavy restaurant doors into the hot Nevada night. The valet handed me my keys. I tipped him a 20 from my own pocket, the kind of money my father didn't think I deserved. I climbed into my truck, turned the ignition, and sat in the parking lot for exactly 10 seconds. I wasn't collecting myself. I was making a decision. They didn't know who I really was. They didn't know what 3 years in the dark had turned me into. I shifted into drive and pulled onto the highway, the desert air blasting through the cracked window, carrying the faint smell of sagebrush and asphalt. I drove toward Nellis Air Force Base, toward the bunker, where the woman they dismissed as a grocery store afterthought commanded the most lethal training squadron in the United States military. I was ready to show them exactly what their $50 daughter was worth. That dinner was just the latest cut in a pattern carved 3 years earlier, when everything I had built was stolen from me in a fluorescent lit room that smelled like aviation fuel and betrayal. 3 years ago, I was the top female pilot in the 422nd Test and Evaluation Squadron at Nellis. My records were flawless. 17 consecutive perfect flight evaluations. 0 safety infractions, 0 missed sorties. I flew the F-15E Strike Eagle like it was stitched into my central nervous system, every input calibrated, every maneuver precise to within a fraction of a degree. I logged more night combat training hours than any pilot in my class, male or female. But excellence breeds envy in a system built to protect mediocre men who wear the right last names. During a live fire training operation over the Tonopah Range, Kevin Ripper Stone, a captain from a long line of generals whose family photos lined the walls of the officers' club, flew a careless, ego-driven scissor maneuver. He clipped my slipstream at over 400 knots, the turbulent air from his engines slamming into my aircraft like a wall. My F-15 kicked violently. The stick jerked in my hand. The warning panel lit up in amber and red, and for 3 full seconds the jet tried to swap ends, the nose yawing left as the tail whipped right, the onset of a flat spin that at that speed and altitude would have been unrecoverable. I wrestled the stick with everything I had, my forearms burning, my boots jammed into the rudder pedals, sweat pouring into my eyes under the visor. I fought the jet back. I recovered. I landed safely, taxied to the parking spot, and shut down the engines. My hands were shaking on the throttles when I finally pulled them to idle. Kevin landed 5 minutes later, hopped out of his cockpit, grinning, and immediately filed a hazard report against me. I stood at attention before the squadron commander in the inquiry room the following morning. The fluorescent lights were blinding, buzzing overhead, casting a harsh white glare over the institutional gray walls. The air smelled of floor polish and stale cigarettes. Kevin sat slumped in a leather chair across the room, one ankle crossed over his knee, casually picking at his fingernails as if he were waiting for a haircut appointment. When the commander asked for his statement, Kevin didn't even look at me. He leaned forward, smirking at the commander like they were old fraternity brothers at a reunion dinner, and stated with theatrical confidence, "She's emotionally unstable because it's her time of the month." I gritted my teeth so hard I tasted copper at the back of my jaw. I waited for the commander to slam his fist on the desk. I waited for him to throw Kevin out of the room. I waited for the system to work the way it was supposed to. Instead, the commander nodded slowly, scribbling something in his green military notebook without looking up. Kevin leaned back and resumed picking his nails. Nobody asked for my telemetry data. Nobody reviewed the radar tapes. Nobody acknowledged that the flight recorder would prove exactly who crossed whose flight path. The inquiry was over in 12 minutes. The real knife to the ribs came that evening. I sat on the edge of my narrow bunk in the bachelor officer's quarters, still in my flight suit, the zipper pulled down halfway, the sweat from the day dried to salt stains on my collar. I picked up my phone and called my dad, the retired colonel who had spent 30 years in the Air Force, the man who understood chain of command flight safety protocols and the sacred trust between wingmen. I expected him to defend his daughter's honor. I explained the telemetry data. I told him about Kevin's slipstream violation. I told him about the near-fatal flat spin. I described the inquiry and how nobody reviewed the evidence. I laid it all out with the precision of a pilot delivering a mission debrief. Dad listened in silence. When I finished, he just sighed heavily into the receiver, a long, wet exhale. The sound of a man inconvenienced by a phone call he wished he hadn't answered. "I told you the cockpit isn't for women," he muttered. The line went dead. He hung up on me. I held the phone against my ear for 10 full seconds, listening to the dead static, waiting for it to mean something else. It didn't. They stripped me of my combat wings within the month. No formal court-martial, no public hearing, just a quiet reassignment buried in administrative paperwork, a signature on a transfer order that nobody protested, and a one-way walk out of the sunlight into a concrete hole in the ground. I took a position in the vault, the underground tactical command center for the aggressor squadron, buried 3 stories beneath the Nevada desert. The bunker had no windows. The air smelled permanently of ozone, old coffee, and overheated circuit boards. The walls sweated condensation in the summer. The fluorescent tubes cast a permanent blue-gray twilight that made everyone look slightly ill. I embraced the darkness. I took the discipline of a soldier who had been betrayed by her own army and her own blood, and I forged my trauma into a blade sharper than anything in the national arsenal. I spent 18 hours a day in front of classified screens, studying every combat tactic archived in the Department of Defense, every engagement pattern from Korea to the Gulf, every known and theorized blind spot in the United States Air Force training doctrine. I ate alone at my console. I ran 5 miles every morning at 4:30 a.m. before the desert sun rose, before anyone else on base was awake, pounding the cracked asphalt perimeter road in complete darkness. I didn't just learn how to fly again, I learned how to hunt our own pilots. I deconstructed every ace pilot's strategy like a mechanic disassembling an engine, cataloging each component, identifying every flaw, and building countermeasures the Pentagon hadn't even theorized. Within 18 months, I earned the rank of Major and took command of the entire Red Air Aggressor Squadron, the designated enemy force that exists to test and break American fighter pilots in simulated combat. I built a lethal squadron of outcast pilots and operators who had been overlooked, passed over, or discarded by the same system that threw me into the dark. Sarge had been denied promotion 3 times because he refused to play political games. Spike had been sidelined after questioning a colonel's tactical decision during a live exercise. Every member of my team had a scar and a grudge, and I turned both into operational advantages. I didn't need my family's validation anymore. I didn't need a pat on the back from a father who viewed his firstborn daughter as a factory defect he couldn't return. I sat in the command chair in the center of the vault, staring at the glowing radar screens, my face illuminated in deep crimson light from the tactical display. I tightened my grip on the leather armrests until they creaked. I was no longer the victim. I was the apex predator waiting in the dark, and the prey didn't even know they had already walked into my kill zone. The silence in the Nellis briefing room after the general spoke my name was deafening. 400 pilots held their breath. Mason's smirk had disintegrated, replaced by a pale, sickly dread that drained the color from his tanned face and left his lips slightly parted, frozen mid-smirk. General Sterling straightened his spine, tugged the hem of his service coat, and offered me a crisp textbook salute. The kind you give to a superior. I didn't look at Mason. Not a glance, not a flicker of acknowledgement. He ceased to exist. I returned the general's salute with razor-sharp precision, my palm angled exactly 45 degrees, my elbow locked. I dropped the salute, turned on my heel with a snap that echoed off the linoleum floor, and marched up to the podium. My boots struck the concrete in a cadence so steady it sounded mechanical. I reached the microphone and wrapped my fingers around it. I stared down at the hundreds of pilots, row after row of flight suits, and crossed arms, the same men who had been laughing at me 90 seconds earlier. I watched the laughter die in their throats, one face at a time, as they realized the woman they had mocked was the person who would decide their fate for the next 2 weeks. I am Major Beverly Baker. Call sign Falcon 1. For the next 2 weeks, I hold the power of life and death over you in the sky, I commanded. My voice didn't waver. It filled the room like a blast wave. Nobody coughed, nobody shifted. I stepped off the stage without another word and walked directly into the Tactical Operations Center through a side corridor. The heavy blast doors sealed behind me with a pneumatic hiss, locking out the stunned silence of the regular Air Force. Inside, it was my world. The vault hummed with the low frequency of cooling fans and encrypted communication arrays. Master Sergeant Mike Sarge Evans, a 50-year-old combat veteran with a face like carved granite hands scarred from 3 decades of working on jet engines in 100-degree heat, and a voice that could strip paint off a bulkhead, walked up to me. He didn't offer congratulations. He didn't clap. He didn't give me a condescending pat on the back or a motivational speech. He reached into the cargo pocket on his thigh, pulled out a Velcro squadron patch, and pressed it firmly onto the empty space on my flight suit shoulder. Falcon 1. The patch he had kept in that pocket for 2 years, waiting for the moment I stepped into the light. Then he handed me a steaming mug of black unsweetened coffee, the industrial stuff brewed in a pot that hadn't been cleaned since the Clinton administration. He gave me a single respectful nod. No words. Behind him, Lieutenant Spike Hernandez, my lead. Red Air pilot, a wiry Dominican with the fastest hands on a flight stick I had ever seen, tapped 2 fingers against his forehead in a casual salute from his console. A thin smile cracked his usual stone-faced composure. These men had bled with me in the sky. They had trusted me with their lives at Mach 2 in pitch-black nighttime exercises. They had never once questioned my authority, my judgment, or my right to be in that cockpit. This was my real family, not genetics, G-forces. I took my seat at the central console and placed the coffee beside the keyboard. The red flag exercise commenced at noon. Within the first hour, my monitors lit up with dozens of aircraft signatures crisscrossing the Nevada test range. Mason was out there in an F-16, his transponder beacon blinking on my screen like a neon bar sign. He couldn't handle the humiliation of the briefing room, so he was overcompensating in the sky. Over the unencrypted radio frequency, Mason was broadcasting loudly, bragging about his flight path, stepping on other pilots' transmissions, utterly shattering radio discipline, the most basic rule of aerial combat operations. His wingman attempted to call a standard formation check. Mason talked over him, cutting him off mid-sentence to announce a target he thought he spotted. He broke away from his four-ship formation, shoving his throttle forward and diving down to chase one of my drone decoys, a cheap electronic phantom that any disciplined pilot with even basic situational awareness would have identified and dismissed within seconds. Mason wanted a quick kill. He wanted to hear the satisfying tone of a simulated missile lock so he could report a victory to Dad on the observation deck. He wanted a show. Spike keyed his mic from the cockpit of Red 2, 15,000 feet above Mason's position, looking straight down at his exposed aircraft like a hawk studying a field mouse. He had a clean infrared lock on Mason's flank. All he needed was my order. One word, and Mason's cockpit would scream with the flatline wail of a simulated kill. I watched Mason's radar blip isolate itself on the display, drifting further and further from his formation like a balloon cut loose from its string, climbing blindly into an altitude block he hadn't been cleared for. I pressed my thumb onto the communications button. "Hold your fire, Red 2. I ordered, keeping my voice smooth, almost casual. Spike didn't question it. He trusted my instinct. He trusted the predator who had spent 3 years in this chair studying the patterns of overconfident men. In psychological warfare, you don't kill a narcissist early. If I shot Mason down in the first hour of the first engagement, he would blame the equipment. He would blame the sun angle. He would blame Spike's aircraft variant for having an unfair radar advantage. He would blame everything except the man in the mirror. I leaned back in my chair, sipped the bitter, scalding coffee, and watched Mason's blip climb higher into the sky. I was going to let him fly so high that he actually believed he was God right before I severed his wings, and let gravity teach him the lesson his father never did. Day 3 of the exercise. The Nevada desert was in a foul mood, whipping up 40-knot crosswinds and thermals that jolted aircraft like potholes on a dirt road. The conditions tested even the 20-year veterans, and 2 sorties had already been delayed for weather holds. On the VIP observation deck, a glass-enclosed balcony overlooking the flight line, I knew Dad was standing with his binoculars pressed to his face, scanning the sky for his Golden Boy's aircraft number. Mason knew it too. Every move he made in that cockpit was a performance for an audience of one. Desperate for his father's applause, Mason completely ignored the minimum altitude hard deck limit, the invisible floor set at 5,000 feet above ground level, below which no pilot was allowed to maneuver during the exercise for safety reasons. My radar operator flagged it immediately, his voice tense through the headset. Mason was pushing his F-16 into a steep, aggressive dive, bleeding altitude, at an alarming rate, trying to execute an unauthorized barrel roll right through a congested airspace sector where 3 other aircraft were conducting separate engagements. He was threading his jet between other pilots' flight paths, like a drunk driver weaving through highway traffic. I stood up from my console, my chair rolling backward and hitting the wall. My eyes locked on the telemetry data streaming across the primary display. Mason's transponder data painted a picture of a pilot completely out of control, his altitude dropping, his speed increasing, his heading erratic. Then it happened. Mason's F-16 sliced violently across the nose of Spike's aircraft at a closing speed that exceeded 1,000 miles per hour combined. The collision warning system in the operations center shrieked a deafening alarm, a piercing electronic scream that drilled into my eardrums and froze every operator's hands over their keyboards. The room went white with sound. Over the radio, I heard Spike. Not words, a sound. A guttural choking grunt forced from the deepest part of his chest, the involuntary noise a human body makes when subjected to forces it was never designed to endure. Spike had yanked his control stick so hard to avoid a mid-air collision that would have vaporized both aircraft that the sudden onset of 9Gs was tearing the blood from his brain, draining it downward into his legs, collapsing his vision into a narrowing tunnel. His G-suit inflated to maximum pressure, squeezing his legs and abdomen, but the forces were overwhelming. He managed to stabilize his aircraft rolling wings level at 4,000 feet, barely above the hard deck. The telemetry confirmed his airframe had absorbed structural stress dangerously close to the F-16's design limit. One more second, and his wings would have folded like paper. His voice came through the radio. 10 seconds later, strained and barely audible, pushed through clenched teeth and an oxygen mask fogged with exertion. Red Leader, Red 2. I'm still here. Those 4 words carried the weight of a man who had just stared through the keyhole of his own coffin. I stood at my console and waited. I waited for Mason to follow standard operating procedure. I waited for him to call a knock-it-off the universal safety call that every pilot is trained to make after a near-miss incident. I waited for him to check on his wingman to ask if the man he had nearly killed was conscious alive flying. Instead, the radio crackled with static. Then Mason's voice filled the ops center, dripping with entitlement and manufactured rage. "Fly carefully, you idiot." "Get out of my airspace," he barked. He had just nearly murdered my subordinate, a pilot who had survived 2 combat deployments and had a 3-year-old daughter waiting at home, and his first instinct was to blame the man he almost killed. A cold, absolute silence fell over the operations center. Every operator froze. Every head turned to look at me. Sarge, standing 3 feet behind my chair, uncrossed his arms. Spike was alive. That was the only fact that mattered for the next 5 seconds. The 6th second was mine. I stood motionless, feeling the last fraying thread of anything resembling family obligation or sibling mercy inside my chest, pulled tight, then snap with a clean surgical finality. It left nothing behind. No anger, no sadness, just icy, irreversible military resolve. I leaned over the console, gripping the microphone stand so hard the metal base scraped across the desk surface. I bypassed the standard tactical frequencies and broadcast directly on the emergency guard frequency, the universally monitored channel that every aircraft in the sky, military and civilian, is legally required to hear and obey. "Knock it off. Knock it off. All aircraft return to base immediately." I barked, my voice echoing across the desert through every cockpit speaker within 100 miles. The 2 words all stop carry the force of divine law in military aviation. Everything stops. No debate, no questions. I didn't wait for acknowledgement. I ripped the headset off my head, the cable catching momentarily on the console, before snapping free and turned to face my intelligence team. My eyes were flat. Dead to any civilian mercy, dead to any sisterly restraint. Sarge stepped forward, his boots heavy on the concrete floor. "Activate the full ghost protocol for tomorrow," I commanded, adjusting the collar of my flight suit with one hand, the other hand flat on the console. My voice dropped to the frequency I reserved for terminal operations. "I will burn this desert down." Sarge gave one sharp nod, turned on his heel, and walked to the encryption console. Spike was going to land safely tonight. Mason was going to wish he hadn't. Has a family member ever demanded you sacrifice your own hard work just to cover up their mistakes? Hit the like button and tell me your story in the comments. Because what my dad asked me to do next was the final nail in the coffin of our relationship. 5 a.m. on the day of the final mock battle. The sky outside was still black. I stood alone in the locker room, the fluorescent tubes buzzing overhead, casting a cold blue-white light over rows of gray metal lockers. I pulled on my G-suit, cinching the straps tight around my calves, my thighs, my abdomen, each strap a tourniquet of preparation. The nylon fabric pressed against my skin. I zipped the front closure up to my sternum. My phone buzzed on the metal bench beside me, the vibration amplified by the steel into a harsh, rattling sound that echoed off the bare concrete walls. The screen glowed in the dim room. One word: Dad. I stood there looking at the phone, watching it vibrate against the bench. Ring 1, ring 2, ring 3. On the third ring, I picked it up, pressed accept, and placed it on the shelf inside my open locker on speaker. I went back to checking the seals on my oxygen mask, running my thumb along the rubber gasket, pressing each edge to test for leaks, refusing to give him the courtesy of my full attention. He didn't say hello. He didn't ask how I was. He didn't ask if Spike the pilot his son nearly killed was physically cleared to fly today. He didn't ask about the weather conditions or the exercise parameters. His voice carried the heavy, authoritative tone of a man who had spent 30 years issuing orders to subordinates who couldn't refuse a voice he still believed carried the weight of rank, even though he had been retired for a decade. I know yesterday was a bit bumpy. He started his tone casual, almost dismissive, reducing his son's near-fatal act of negligence to the verbal equivalent of a parking lot fender bender. I kept my hands busy. I ran the seal check on my mask a second time. I didn't respond. Dad cleared his throat, a wet, heavy sound through the phone speaker. But today the general finalizes the roster. You're the older sister, you need to clear the obstacles so Mason can shine, for the family's legacy. The words hung in the empty locker room like nerve gas. He was ordering me to throw the battle, artificially, deliberately. He wanted me to command my Red Air pilots, the pilots who trusted me, who had put their lives in my hands to fly like incompetent amateurs, to serve as clay pigeons so Mason could rack up fake kills on his scoreboard and strut into General Sterling's office with an inflated combat record. He wanted me to manufacture a false hero so that a man who nearly killed a fellow pilot could earn a combat deployment where real bullets, real missiles, and real death were the operating conditions. He was asking me to betray every principle the uniform represented. He was demanding I throw away 3 years of work, 3 years of swallowed humiliation, 3 years of rebuilding myself in a concrete tomb just to feed the ego of a son who couldn't survive a training exercise without blaming everyone else for his own failures. And he wrapped it in the word legacy, like a gift card in a paper envelope. I stopped moving. I stared at the phone sitting on the metal shelf inside the locker. My jaw clenched so tight the muscles in my neck ached, a dull, grinding pain that radiated up to my temples. I could feel the old programming trying to activate, the familiar weight of guilt creeping up from my stomach into my chest, the lifelong conditioning of a daughter trained to obey her father's voice before she could even tie her own shoes. Good daughters don't argue. Good daughters sacrifice. Good daughters bend. I placed both hands flat against the cold metal of the locker door. The steel bit into my palms. I took a sharp, tactical breath, filling my lungs completely, then forcing the air out hard, pushing the civilian weakness from my body like purging contaminated air from a cockpit after a chemical alarm. I was not his daughter right now. I was not Beverly. I was Major Baker, and Major Baker does not negotiate with manipulators. I picked up the phone with one hand. I didn't yell. I didn't argue. I didn't challenge his logic or point out the criminal negligence of his request. Arguing gives a manipulator the illusion that their words carry legitimate weight, that there is a negotiation happening, that the outcome is still in play. I spoke with the chilling, flat effect of a sniper confirming a target acquisition through a scope. No emotion, no hesitation. Just the cold transmission of an inevitable outcome. Don't worry, Dad. I replied, my voice echoing slightly off the concrete walls of the empty locker room. Today I will give Mason exactly what he deserves. I pressed the red button and ended the call. I didn't wait for his response. I didn't give him a single second to interpret redirect or gaslight. I tossed the phone into the locker. It clattered against the metal shelf. I slammed the door shut with a clang that rang through the room like a hammer striking an anvil. I grabbed my helmet from the top shelf, tucked it under my arm, and walked toward the flight line exit. The hunt was on. I climbed the aluminum ladder, bolted to the side of the black F-16 Aggressor, each rung cold under my gloved hands. The ground crew chief stood below, clipboard in hand, giving me a thumbs up after the final walk-around inspection. I swung my leg over the cockpit rail and dropped into the ejection seat, the familiar cradle of steel and fabric that had held me at 30,000 feet more times than I could count. I secured the heavy 4-point harness across my chest, clicking each titanium buckle with practice speed, left shoulder, left, hip, right hip, then yanking the central release to cinch everything tight against my body. The canopy whined as it lowered on its hydraulic arms, sealing me inside the glass and titanium cocoon, cutting off the desert wind and every sound of the outside world. I plugged in my communications cable and oxygen hose. The cockpit monitors hummed to life, bathing my face in green and amber light. I felt the familiar vibration of the twin jet engines spooling up through the fuselage, through the seat, through my spine, the deep, gathering roar of controlled violence. My hands moved across the switches with the precision of a concert pianist. Master arm, navigation systems, radar standby, electronic warfare suite. I ran through the pre-flight checklist in 12 seconds. Today, the sky was my chessboard, and I had already planned every move. I keyed the radio. Red lead taxiing. I pushed the throttle forward past the detent into afterburner, and the sheer brutal force of 25,000 pounds of thrust pinned me against the ejection seat. The runway markers blurred into a single white streak. I pulled back on the stick, and the nose lifted the wheels, left the concrete, and the earth dropped away below me. I climbed into the blue. Once in the combat sector, 30,000 feet above the Nevada desert, the brown and tan landscape sprawling to every horizon like a crumpled map, I initiated Ghost Protocol. The command went out over the encrypted data link to my electronic warfare team on the ground. They activated the full-spectrum jamming suite, flooding Mason's data link feed with phantom radar signatures. Dozens of false aircraft contacts materialized on his radar screen, appearing and disappearing at random intervals, changing speed and altitude, splitting into formations, and dissolving into static. His cockpit display turned into a chaotic mess of false targets, a hall of mirrors at 30,000 feet. Over the intercepted communications channel, I could hear Mason's breathing grow rapid and panicked through his oxygen mask, the quick, shallow gasps of a man whose confidence was evaporating. He was jerking his control stick, wildly snapping his head left and right inside the cockpit, trying to visually acquire targets that existed only as electrons. He snapped at his wingman over the radio, blaming him for not calling out threats. His wingman, a disciplined captain named Torres, who had seen through Mason's incompetence on day one, transmitted a calm, measured response that Mason immediately talked over, his voice rising in pitch with each transmission. Mason slammed his throttle into afterburner, engaging maximum power, bleeding fuel at a catastrophic rate to chase electronic ghosts across the sky. His fuel gauge dropped visibly on my telemetry feed. He abandoned his formation entirely, peeling away from his wingman to pursue a phantom contact that my operators moved just fast enough to stay beyond his missile range. His wingman, now isolated and exposed, took a simulated kill shot from Spike within 40 seconds. Torres never even saw it coming. He was too busy watching Mason fly away from him. Mason was isolated, fuel-starved, psychologically shattered. His radar was useless, his wingman was dead, and he was alone in a sky full of ghosts. Exactly where I needed him. I reached forward with my left hand and flipped the switch on my radar emissions panel, killing my own active radar. I went completely dark. My F-16 vanished from every radar screen in the exercise, including Mason's. I ceased to exist in the electronic spectrum. I pushed the jet into a punishing high-G split-S maneuver, rolling the aircraft inverted, pulling the nose straight down toward the earth, and sweeping through a half-loop that reversed my direction and dropped me below Mason's altitude. The G-suit inflated hard against my legs and abdomen, squeezing the blood upward toward my brain with mechanical force, fighting gravity's attempt to drain consciousness from my body. I gritted my teeth and growled through the pressure, the sound lost inside my oxygen mask. I pulled 7 Gs through the bottom of the turn, my vision narrowing to a gray tunnel before the suit caught up and the blood returned. I leveled off, fell out of the sun, the blinding white glare hiding my jet like a curtain of light, and silently slipped into the dead zone directly behind Mason's engine exhaust. The blind spot. The place no radar can see. No sensor can reach, where only a pilot skilled enough to fly formation at combat speed can survive. I matched his throttle setting, perfectly adjusting by fractions of an inch, hovering less than 200 yards directly behind his engine nozzles. The heat distortion from his exhaust rippled across my canopy like a desert mirage. He had absolutely no idea I was there. I rode his tail like the shadow of death for 45 seconds. 45 seconds in aerial combat is a lifetime. In a real war, he would have been dead 44 seconds ago. I reached for the radio switch on my throttle grip. I bypassed the standard exercise frequency and keyed directly into Mason's private channel, the discrete frequency assigned only to his aircraft, the one only his ears would hear. My voice was a whisper of absolute terminal certainty. "Check your 6th, Lieutenant." Through the canopy 200 yards away, I watched him physically jump in his seat. His helmet snapped right, then left. Then he craned his neck over his shoulder, straining against the harness, and looked directly behind him. My black F-16, painted in the flat matte black and crimson star insignia of the aggressor squadron, filled his entire rear canopy view. I was close enough to see the white reflection of his visor as he turned. I had a hard infrared missile lock. The seeker tone screamed a steady, unbreakable pitch in his cockpit, the high-pitched whine of a weapon that had already decided he was dead. I squeezed the trigger on my flight stick. "Fox 2, kill," I stated flatly. The tone in his cockpit shifted to a continuous flatline wail, the unmistakable sound of a confirmed simulated kill. Mason's aircraft wobbled, his hands clearly shaking on the controls. The Golden Boy was dead. The debriefing room was packed shoulder to shoulder 2 hours after we landed. Every pilot from the exercise, every flight instructor, every senior officer stationed at Nellis had filed through the double doors and filled the tiered seating. The room smelled of flight suit, nylon coffee, and sweat. General Sterling sat in the front row, his service cap on his knee, his expression carved from the same stone as Mount Rushmore. Next to him sat my dad, Richard, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, his jaw set in the confident, expectant posture of a man who had already written the victory speech for his son. He had no idea what was on that screen. I stood at the front of the room, my hands resting lightly on the edges of the wooden podium. My Falcon 1 patch was visible on my flight suit shoulder. I didn't look at my dad. I didn't scan the crowd for Mason. I tapped a single key on the laptop connected to the overhead projector, and the machine hummed to life. The massive white screen illuminated with the green granular data from Mason's own heads-up display, recording the HUD tape that captured every input, every sensor reading every tactical decision his aircraft made, and every catastrophic decision he failed to make. I didn't raise my voice. I spoke with the clinical detached precision of a forensic pathologist performing an autopsy on a body that the entire room had believed was alive and healthy. I advanced the timeline frame by frame, narrating each failure with the same dispassionate tone I would use to describe a mechanical malfunction in an engine component. I paused the video at the exact moment Mason's aircraft broke formation, his F-16 peeling away from his wingman in a sharp, unauthorized divergence. Lieutenant Baker abandons his wingman, a fatal tactical error. I stated, my finger resting on the spacebar. I let the silence hold for 3 full seconds, letting the weight of the word fatal settle into every seat. I advanced the tape. The room watched Mason's fuel gauge deplete in real time, the green bar shrinking visibly as he burned through his reserves, chasing phantom contacts across the radar screen. He burns through 40% of his fuel, chasing electronic phantoms. I fast-forwarded again. Then I played the final 45 seconds. The room watched collectively, holding its breath, as my black F-16 appeared on the HUD recording, like a ghost materializing from the static, sliding into position directly behind Mason's aircraft, undetected, unseen, invisible. The infrared lock tone activated. The kill confirmation flashed. I paused the tape on the final frame and turned to face the room. He flies blind for 45 seconds. In actual combat, 4 families would receive death notices just because of his arrogance. I let that number 4 sit in the room like a grenade with the pin pulled. The silence lasted 5 seconds. Then Mason erupted. He shoved his metal folding chair backward with both hands. It crashed against the concrete floor with a sharp metallic bang that echoed off the cinder block walls. He was on his feet, his face flushed purple from the jaw to the hairline, the veins in his neck bulging, his entire body vibrating with rage and humiliation. He pointed a trembling finger at me, his arm shaking like he was holding a weight too heavy for his frame, and screamed at the top of his lungs. She cheated, Dad, save me. She rigged the system. His voice cracked on the word, save, splitting into a high-pitched whine that exposed the terrified child beneath the arrogant uniform. He looked desperately at Richard, his eyes wide wet, pleading, searching for the man who had always made the phone calls, always pulled the strings, always smoothed the road. Dad sat frozen in his chair. His mouth was slightly open. The arms that had been crossed with confidence 2 minutes ago now hung limp at his sides. The color had drained completely from his face, replaced by a gray, hollowed-out mask, the face of a man watching the building he spent a lifetime constructing collapse floor by floor in front of a live audience. The HUD tape was military-grade evidence. It couldn't be spun, reinterpreted, or buried in administrative paperwork. It was undeniable, frame by frame, second by second. I didn't flinch at Mason's screaming. I didn't step back. I simply removed my hands from the podium, stood straight, and stepped to the side, yielding the floor with a calm precision that communicated everything the room needed to understand. Colonel Hayes, the flight safety officer, a man whose signature had ended more careers than any weapon system in the inventory, stood up from the back row. He adjusted his service coat, walked to the front of the room, his boots echoing in the silence like a metronome counting down. He didn't look at Dad. He didn't acknowledge Mason's outburst. He looked directly at General Sterling. Based on this gross negligence and endangerment of fellow personnel, my recommendation is immediate. Hayes stated, his voice filling every corner of the room with the finality of a judge reading a sentence. He turned his head slowly and locked eyes with Mason, who was still standing his chest, heaving his finger still pointed at me. Permanent revocation of flight status. Mason's knees buckled. He grabbed the edge of the desk behind him to keep himself upright. His hand slipped. He caught himself on the chair back, clutching it with white knuckles. Dad slumped forward in his chair and put his head in both hands, his shoulders rounded. He looked like a man who had just been told his house was on fire with everything he owned inside it. The kingdom of lies had officially collapsed, and the whole room sat in the rubble watching. I walked out of the briefing facility and into the blinding Nevada sun. The heat radiating off the asphalt parking lot hit me like opening a furnace door. The tar was soft and sticky under my boots. 2 maintenance airmen loading equipment onto a truck nearby glanced in my direction. As I pulled my keys from my flight suit pocket and unlocked my truck, I heard heavy, rapid footsteps behind me. The unmistakable slap of leather loafers on hot pavement, the sound of a man who hadn't run in years trying to sprint. It was Richard. He was sweating through his polo shirt, dark half-moons spreading under both arms. His face was red and blotchy, his jaw set, his fists clenched at his sides. He closed the distance fast, lunging forward, pushing his face inches from mine, trying to use his physical presence to intimidate me the way he had when I was 15 years old and couldn't fight back. He unleashed a barrage of words, his voice cracking between fury and desperation. A man trying to rebuild his authority with nothing but volume and proximity. You humiliated this family. You're jealous of his talent. He spat, his eyes wild with denial, a thin string of saliva stretching between his lips. I didn't step back, not 1 inch. I planted my boots firmly on the softened asphalt and squared my shoulders, rolling them back until my posture was rigid as a flagpole. I looked slightly down at him. He was shorter than I remembered. He had shrunk in the years since I stopped bending for him. He tried to keep going, his words tumbling over each other, blaming the radar calibration, blaming General Sterling's personal vendetta, blaming the weather conditions, blaming the electronic warfare system for being too realistic. I let him vent for exactly 3 seconds. I counted each one. Then I cut him off. My voice erupted from my chest with a force that came from 3 years underground, from a $50 gift card from a dial tone after a father abandoned his daughter. You are the one humiliating him. I roared. The sound echoed across the parking lot, bouncing off the rows of vehicles, sharp and violent. The 2 airmen by the truck stopped moving. Richard physically recoiled, stumbling a half step backward, his loafers scraping on the asphalt. He had never heard that voice from his daughter. That voice belonged to a major who commanded the most lethal training squadron on the continent. I stepped into his space, closing the gap he had created. I locked my eyes onto his and I watched the arrogance flicker. If I let him go into real combat with that arrogance tonight, you wouldn't be going out for steak. I pointed a finger directly at his chest and tapped his sternum hard, once pushing him slightly off balance. He grabbed at his shirt collar reflexively. You'd be sitting at home waiting for an officer to bring a folded flag? Richard froze. The word flag landed on him like a physical blow. His jaw went slack. His mouth opened, but nothing came out. The image of a military funeral, the white-gloved honor guard folding the American flag into a perfect triangle. The solemn knock on the front door at 2 a.m., the chaplain standing beside a uniformed officer, the rehearsed words of condolence that no parent should ever have to hear. All of it pierced through 30 years of denial in a single second. His eyes changed. The angry colonel disappeared. A terrified old man took his place standing in a parking lot sweating through a department store polo, realizing that his daughter had not destroyed his son. She had saved his life, and he had tried to stop her. I watched his shoulders drop. The air went out of him like a punctured tire. I adjusted the collar of my flight suit, a slow, deliberate motion, the way a soldier adjusts their uniform after inspection. Because appearances matter, because discipline matters, because the uniform means something, even when the people wearing it do not. My voice dropped to a cold, controlled baseline. I grounded him to save his life, I stated. The words carried no rage. They carried absolute disgust, the kind of disgust that cannot be argued with because it is not an emotion. It is a conclusion. I opened my truck door. Don't call me until you learn how to respect this uniform. I climbed into the cab, pulled the heavy door shut with a solid thunk, and turned the ignition. The engine rumbled to life. I didn't look in the rearview mirror. I shifted into drive and pulled out of the parking lot. In my side mirror, Richard Baker grew smaller and smaller, a diminishing figure standing alone on the scorching asphalt, his arms hanging at his sides. The two airmen walked away without looking back. Nobody went to stand beside him. 1 year later, I stood by the reinforced glass window of the 64th Aggressor Squadron Commander's office, my office looking down at the corridor below. A familiar sound reached me through the glass. Squeaking. A rhythmic, high-pitched complaint of rubber wheels turning under heavy weight. I looked down. Mason was pushing a metal cart loaded with stacks of classified documents bound for the industrial shredder at the end of the hall. The wheels protested loudly, with every rotation announcing his presence like an alarm clock nobody wanted to hear. His flight suit was gone. He wore a standard utility uniform now. No patches, no wings, no call sign stitched above the breast pocket. Dad had pulled every remaining string, called every retired buddy who still owed him a favor, and managed to keep Mason from receiving a full discharge and a permanent mark on his record. But the deal extracted a price. Mason was stripped of his lieutenant rank, reduced to the lowest administrative grade, and permanently reassigned to base logistics. He spent his days sorting classified waste, filing maintenance reports, and pushing carts of paper down the same hallway where pilots walked to their aircraft. He was the one doing paperwork now. As the cart squeaked past the stairwell beneath my window, he looked up. His eyes found my silhouette behind the glass. I stood still, my hands clasped behind my back. He held my gaze for less than a second, then dropped his eyes to the floor, grabbed the cart handle with both hands, and pushed faster. The squeaking faded down the corridor. I didn't feel the urge to gloat. Gloating requires emotional investment. It requires that the target still holds space in your heart, even if that space is filled with contempt. I had no space left for Mason Baker. I turned back to my desk and sat down in the leather chair. The springs creaked under my weight. A new email notification pinged on my secure terminal, a soft chime that barely registered over the hum of the air conditioning unit. I clicked the inbox. The sender line read, Richard Baker. I opened the email. I read it once, scanning the 2 short paragraphs with the same speed and detachment I used to process intelligence briefings about foreign adversary capabilities. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of the parking lot, no mention of the $50 gift card or the $8,000 watch, no recognition that grounding Mason had saved his life. He used the word family 3 times in 2 paragraphs, deploying it like a battering ram against a locked gate. The purpose of the email was transparent. He wanted me to call General Sterling and pull strings to get Mason reassigned to a cargo squadron flying transport planes. He was still trying to use me as a tool. A year later, and nothing had changed except the method of delivery. I read the email one more time. Then I placed my hands flat on the desk. I felt the smooth wood grain under my fingertips. My breathing was steady. My resting heart rate held at 62 beats per minute. I didn't type a reply. I didn't draft a furious response. I didn't compose a carefully worded rejection explaining my reasoning. I moved the mouse cursor across the screen, the smooth plastic gliding under my index finger, and positioned it over Richard Baker's name. I clicked Archive. The email vanished. Gone. Swallowed into the digital void where it belonged. With that single silent click, I permanently stripped Richard Baker and Mason Baker of any remaining power over my decisions, my emotions, my career, and my life. I stood up. I pushed the chair back from the desk and grabbed my flight helmet from the shelf beside the door. I walked out of the office, my boots marking a steady cadence on the hallway floor. I pushed open the exterior door and stepped onto the sun-drenched flight line. The smell of jet fuel filled my lungs sharp and clean and alive. The concrete was warm under my boots. I stopped and looked up. 2 F-16s from my squadron tore across the deep blue Nevada sky. In perfect formation, their afterburners trailing white-hot exhaust, their engines roaring across the desert like rolling thunder. That sky belonged to me. I earned it in the dark in a windowless bunker with no name tag and no family. I earned it by surviving 9 Gs that would kill a civilian. I earned it by swallowing every insult, every gift card, every slammed door, and turning each scar into a call sign. I am Beverly Baker. I am Falcon 1. Sometimes the strongest revenge isn't a screaming match. It's a silent click of a button that removes toxic people from your life forever. If you found strength in my story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your own victories in the comments below.